Hello everyone, it is Jazz here and welcome to episode 3 of the Jane Eyre Project. This is a literary experiment that I'm doing as a series in which each month I am going to be reading books that are related to Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. If you would like to check out episode 1 in which I pick out my to be read, and also episode 2 where I reread Jane Eyre and vlog the experience as I super analyze all the little nitty-gritty details of that story, I will link it in all the linky places so you can watch that. However, today I'm starting the vlog of me reading The Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. I can't even summarize this book without spoiling Jane Eyre a little bit. So if you haven't read Jane Eyre or don't know the key plot points of Jane Eyre, definitely, discover those before I talk any further about Wide Sargasso Sea. Wide Sargasso Sea, from my understanding, is a prequel and also a parallel novel to Jane Eyre that focuses on Bertha Mason, who, if you don't know, is Mr. Rochester's mad wife in the attic. I decided to kickstart everything off with Wide Sargasso Sea, mostly because I feel like it's one of the novels that somewhat inspired this journey. I've always heard about it, but never actually picked it up. But also, I think it scares me just a little, and I wanted to just rip off that band-aid. Partially it scares me because I'm not sure if I'm going to like the actual writing of it. I'm not sure what I'm getting into, never read this author before, so we'll have to see how that goes. But also, it is going to deal with some tough topics about racism and colonialism and insanity and what it all means, and also it's centered around one of the probably most problematic elements of Jane Eyre, so there's just a lot. To kind of keep things a little bit more concise, or if you want just a quick overview of some elements that the character of Bertha represents, I do recommend you checking out a video that I've linked below from the British Library that focuses on the character of Bertha and some of her symbolism.
So Rochester and Jane Eyre are both haunted by his first wife, by Bertha Mason. And it's one of the most powerful and moving passages of the whole book. And her presence haunts it even when she's not there. And she's such an interesting figure because in some ways she's like Jane. There's lots of parallels between the two of them. Jane's imprisoned early on in the Red Room. We later find Bertha imprisoned in Rochester's house. Both of them have this erotic, romantic relationship with Rochester. It's also that, they're both outsiders. They're both marginalised. But of course, in another way, she's exactly the opposite. She's the other to Jane. What
I think is going to be a big part of this book, and also a big part of Bertha's character in general, is that Bertha is of Creole descent in some way, shape, or form. Now, I did a little research on Jean Rhys, who is the author of this book, and she was also born in the Caribbean on the island of Dominica. So she is actually sort of somewhat in the know about the things that you would see being in an occupied sort of island experience, which I find quite interesting. Also was considered Creole herself. Creole back in the day could be a broad term for people that were just born on a Caribbean island, etc., or it could also mean that you are mixed race. This leads into me discussing expectations I have for this book, which I really just think that this is going to be a more cultural focused book or a more ideology focused book. I think it's going to be more in the literary fiction kind of zone of a story to really discuss the things that are happening in Jamaica and what this character witnesses and experiences, and make a commentary on that as opposed to being plot or character driven. Hello, it's me from the future. So I decided in the end that I would give you a timestamp below in the description, and in that timestamp it's going to be my final thoughts on the whole book and my rating and all that stuff. If you just want to check that out and you haven't read Wide Sargasso Sea yet and you just want to know my thoughts, that will be spoiler free. Now, the rest of this video, probably from part 1 of the reading experience and on, that's probably going to have at least some spoilers, and I know I have some spoilers at the end. I do, however, have a lot of links that I thought were fun references in the description that I do highly recommend for just general experiencing of Wide Sargasso Sea, and also for clarity on some things in the book. So definitely check out that stuff below. I have not been real great at filming anything fun that I've been doing because I'm boring and not fun. But I do come armed with spark notes and some thoughts. So I have completed the first part of the book so far. I did have to dive a little bit into Sparks Notes. I'm going to actually link you to the Sparks Notes page for Wide Sargasso Sea. It's totally free. While the actual writing itself is pretty easy to get into, I think that there's a lot of things where Jean Rhys assumes that you understand the historical and cultural context of the book without a lot of explanation. I don't know if this was done because it's a short book or if it's just something that Jean Rhys assumed, but there were some things in the first couple of pages that I just wasn't fully understanding. And then when I read some summaries and some analyzations on Spark Notes, it really helped me. And then as it went on and I understood things, I didn't have to look at that as much, but I might occasionally look at it just because, you know, it's fun. However, I did, you know, mark in orange things that I wanted to look up, certain words. You may find yourself looking up some vocabulary words as well. So the first thing we learn at the beginning of part 1 is that this first part of the story is going to be narrated by Antoinette Causeway, who will eventually become Bertha Mason. I'm gonna guess that at some point her name becomes changed, but I'm going to kind of jump into that while that actually happens. The reason her last name is Causeway is because it turns out that Mr. Mason is actually going to become her stepfather. Richard is actually her stepbrother. So the Richard Mason that you see in Jane Eyre, he's actually her stepbrother. A lot of this part 1 does delve into topics of slavery and racial divide, as well as general cultural divide. This is around a time when they're trying to emancipate slaves. Obviously, there's a lot of tension going on between the white colonists and the black people that live in Jamaica already. Even within that, there's still a lot of divide, which I think is just a really interesting thing about people. For example, Antoinette's mother, we're just going to call her Antoinette until she's not anymore. Antoinette's mother is very isolated because she was the second wife of Mr. Causeway, who is dead at the beginning of the story. She was too young for him, the people of the higher class think. And then also she was from Martinique, so she's from a French area. So she's really kind of looked down upon, and that's just because, you know, back then at this moment of time, probably the French and the English were not on the best of terms. But even the servant that her mother has, that's kind of like her closest servant, Christophine, who also sometimes cares for Antoinette, she's even divided from the people of color because she is from not from Jamaica. Antoinette has a younger brother named Pierre who does have some disabilities as well. So that causes them to be ostracized even more as well. So the key point here is that everybody in this family, including all the servants and all this, and also because of the remote location which they live in, they are really set apart from others. When you are really set apart and isolated in a situation, it really plays on your mental health, especially if really negative events happen. There are some really negative events. There's a lot of loss that happens as this first part goes on. The story of Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester basically says, well, it was in their genetics that they had issues. But when I was reading this, I was like, anybody would have a mental health moment if you saw how isolated and how damaging certain things would happen. I feel like her mother's subsequent issues with mental health were kind of justified. I kind of want to read this quote, which is kind of referring to Christophine, the servant that Antoinette's mother has, and her mother is talking about this, and she says, I dare say we would have died if she had turned against us, and that would have been a better fate, to die and be forgotten and at peace, not to know that one is abandoned, lied about, helpless. When it says abandoned, lied about, and helpless, that is kind of what this character, the main character, becomes, right? She is, in Jane Eyre, basically Edward Rochester's like, I basically moved from Jamaica to England so that I could have her stored up in this house and I could forget that she ever existed. I do think that there is an interesting just parallel there from her, in this book, her formative years, and that being said about her family from her mother, coming from like a mother figure, and then that is what she eventually becomes. I want to dive into some of the elements that I think really influence this story from actually Jane Eyre. One is the use of motifs. So in Jane Eyre, the motif is the bird motif. In this, the motif of Antoinette is fire, which, if you think about Jane Eyre, is extremely appropriate. She is always setting fires. She died in a fire. And in the story, there are quite a few instances of fire being part of her life in big ways. And I think it's really smart of Jean Rhys, because let's think about it. That means that you could kind of imply that this innate need Bertha has to set fires and use fire is that it comes from a part of her memory that she actually, you know, is acting out either consciously or subconsciously. Dreams are really used in this first part of the story, and they're used as foreshadowing for future events, which is a technique that Charlotte Bronte uses a lot in Jane Eyre. But also there's a lot that Antoinette has in common with not only Jane, but also, I would say, Adele. I think there's this idea of being a very unwanted child, of having parents or aunts or relatives that don't really want you around. Thirdly, this book is not super depressing despite the heaviness of the topics. I may have to update you in the middle of part 2, because part 2 is the longest section, being that it's the middle section. But from the little bit that I've read of it, it is actually from Mr. Rochester's perspective, which I did not expect. So this should be an intriguing deep dive into his mind. There's definitely some things about him that I'm a little like, really, Edward? Really? Also, for part 1, there is a painting that Antoinette in the story is her favorite. It's her favorite painting, and it's called The Miller's Daughter. I will link you to some information about what that symbolizes in Wide Sargasso Sea below if you want to check that out. I got to work way too early for my homeschool tutorial that I teach. So I've been reading a little bit, and I was thinking all of yesterday that it is just a weirder experience reading from Edward Rochester as a 20-year-old something than I thought it was going to be. I don't know why it's so weird. I can't put my finger on it exactly. I don't know if it's because I'm not used to reading anything written in his perspective at all, or if it's because I am used to him being a cantankerous, almost 40-something. Or it could be because Edward, as a 20-something, is profoundly uncomfortable with everything that's happening. I'm going to be honest. Edward Rochester's angst and anxiety right now is bringing me a little, anxiety myself when I read it, but, in a good way. In a, wow, this is well written way. I've reached page 98. I thought that was a good stopping part because there's a page break and we're probably going to move into a new thought. Part 2 is a very oddly claustrophobic is the best word I can say. Claustrophobic sort of feeling. Even when there's a lot of freedom in this book, it still feels very confined. And I think the reason for that is the characters and what they're confronting in this moment. There has been an extreme time jump from the last section of the book. Antoinette and Mr. Rochester, we'll call him Edward because for some reason, when he's 20, I want to call him Edward. They have just gotten married and they're about to go to their honeymoon house, which is this estate that Antoinette had in her family from her mother's side, and it's in an even more remote area. Antoinette and Edward have married people that are entire strangers. Basically, he traveled to Jamaica and then immediately got sick. So he was in a fever and kind of incapacitated when they're hey, marry this chick. For money. It's great. It's going to be awesome. So Richard Mason and Edward's father, that's not good. Antoinette was I really don't want to marry you at one point. And he was such a people pleaser because in this story, Edward is young and kind of a people pleaser because he still has a need to, I'm the second son. I need to step up to being at least somewhat better because my older brother is a super fave and he's gonna inherit everything, right? He's a people pleaser and he's no, you can marry me. We're gonna be safe together. It's gonna be fine. This adds on to the already existing feeling of isolation because Antoinette has never felt like she really fit anywhere. She doesn't fit in any kind of class and or culture. And Edward is I'm used to a certain kind of life that is not this. And thus, both of them have a lot of paranoia going on because they both suffer from a lot of past issues where they feel like they never have really trusted people. It's really sad that they can't click, and the reason that they can't click is because of the thing that they actually have in common, right? The thing they have in common is that she's a woman that wasn't very close to her female figure of a mother, and he is a man that is not very close to his father. And so thus they lack the emotional and social skills to accurately truly communicate. But also I think because of not really having a mother and not really having a father, they don't have a example of what marriage looks like. So the things that they actually do genuinely have in common, they weirdly can't meet on because of trauma. There's an interesting thing that did happen with the little bird motif. And Edward, he very much has a curiosity about birds. And when they're going on their honeymoon, he hears a bird and he's what is that about? I think that's really interesting because of the whole, that being kind of Jane's motif. So even in this moment, it's kind of brilliant that he's kind of drawn to that kind of element of the story. And also for Bertha, other than the fire motif, there's kind of an illusion that she's kind of like an orchid, which I thought was intriguing because orchids are kind of known for being delicate flowers that need a lot of work to grow. Not really 100% sure that like Edward's down to nurture an orchid. This is delightfully unsettling, and I'm gonna read some more of it. Kind of want to decompress after work. It was like a crazy day. So I'm actually going to sit here and create the Jane Eyre playlist that I promised in the last video. Actually, what I thought I would do is make one whole playlist that's called just the Jane Eyre Project, and that way every time I read a book I can add a song for the book that I'm currently reading each month and have just like a full like list of songs for the whole project. I'll actually probably to add some songs that work for this book. If I compile the songs and I still have some music left, I'll actually start reading more of this. It's a couple of days later, and I basically just decided to go ahead and complete the book before I update anything. First of all, because I still can't process everything that's just happened, but also part 3 is super short. Also, I thought tomorrow, probably tomorrow, because I don't know how long it is, I would watch the TV movie adaptation of this. There is another non-TV movie adaptation of this, but I'm gonna watch the TV movie because I have already got a subscription to Acorn TV, and it's, I think, on Acorn TV on Amazon. Have been working on the playlist and listening to my playlist for the Jane Eyre Project, and I'm quite enjoying it. I think I'm actually going to write out the songs and what book they are for on my blog. So I think when I link you to that, I will link you to my blog and just embed the playlist in there so that you know what books, what songs are for. But yeah, wish me luck for the end of reading this book. It's a lot. It's just a lot, guys. It's so much has happened in this tiny book, and how am I going to talk about it? I don't know. So I actually finished Wide Sargasso Sea like a week ago, but my final update was hot garbage when I went to edit it. So here we are again. All these characters went to the dark, we're definitely not perfect people place, and there was a lot to cover. So we're going to cover a lot. Bear with me. I do have to summarize some sections of the book for my own self so that even if you've read this book, it makes sense and you get the context of what I'm talking about as I talk about 2 or 3 of the main points that I want to cover. And then, of course, we do have my final thoughts and rating and all that jazz. Let's start with the middle of part 2. This is the key, like, breaking point of the Antoinette and Edward Rochester relationship up in here. Now, I think the catalyst for this little bit of a break is that Edward starts hearing from various sources, mostly unreliable ones. I mind you, all this sort of half-truth and rumor about Antoinette's past, her parents, her just all the things that he heard and that he mentions in Jane Eyre. And instead of being, reasonable and talking to his wife about it, because that would make an abundance of sense, our seriously awkward man with his little quirks decides that he's not going to do that. He's just going to be distant and weird. And Antoinette doesn't really know what that's about, and it understandably really hurts her feelings. But on top of this is when Edward Rochester, I think, has what I interpreted as his own little mental break, if you will. He can't handle it. I think it dawns on him that he has married someone that he doesn't know at all and was only somewhat physically attracted to, and that he's been utterly manipulated by people in his life that he trusted to make this happen. It's a full-on spiral. This is the point in which Edward starts calling Antoinette Bertha at this point. Now, to really get like a deep dive on names and the importance of names in the original work, Jane Eyre, I'm going to recommend you to a YouTuber, and she has done a whole video on Bertha and what Edward Rochester calls her in Jane Eyre, as well as what he calls Jane.
I want to think about names and naming. Who calls who what? And I think this is interesting because it tells us a lot, I think, about how identity is controlled within the novel, or at least how certain characters try to control other people's identities within the novel. I asked the question, what does Mr. Rochester call Bertha Mason? Well, as one might suppose from the terms of the question, he calls her by the name of Bertha Mason. You might think, well, in that case, this is going to be a very short video. But the point that I want to interrogate is why he calls her by the name of Bertha Mason and does not call her, as one might expect, perhaps, Mrs. Rochester. She is, after all, his wife.
This is a really brilliant moment of Jean Rhys's kind of deep dive into Rochester's character, is that he does really try to exert control in his life over controlling other people's identity. It's a really innate part of his character in the original work, and I really love that Jean Rhys picked up on that. Identity is such an important part of both of these books, and discovering your identity or losing your identity, or what that even means. So when Edward Rochester in Wide Sargasso Sea starts calling her Bertha, I think it's his way of trying to kind of bring her into his world and make her a person that fits into sort of a more English sort of world, because that does sound to him, I suppose, like a more English name than Antoinette does. And it's his way to kind of get control over the situation, since he's not in the best mental place. But it's obviously, to the reader, a little frustrating, because stealing someone's identity or taking their identity, not really the best way to get control over your own life. Ironically, in Wide Sargasso Sea, Antoinette eventually ends up not using Rochester's name or calling him by his name. She calls him that man, or the man who hates me. Yikes. Like I said, this is a thing that he does even in Jane Eyre by being kind of manipulative with her and trying to buy her expensive gifts to make Jane more of what he thinks of as a, I guess, wealthy lady of the house, and all those things that he does. Now, the difference between Jane and Antoinette is that Jane calls him on that crap and says, I'm not doing that. Free and independent being here. No, she is still in a moment of self-discovery, but she knows enough about who she is to know that she is not that, and she knows how to express to him in sort of her humorous, calm way that we're not doing that today. But Antoinette, she has never really been very firm in her identity, and the only things that I think at that point in the story, about halfway through this book, that she genuinely knows that she has in terms of her own identity are her name, and the fact that since she didn't have really any identity with other people very much, or community of her own, she decides, I think, very much that she is going to be Mr. Rochester's wife, that she's going to be Mrs. Rochester. So he's, by pulling away from her, kind of threatening that as well. This leads me to my next point, which is all about Antoinette's desperate need to make this work and be in love with Edward. And I think a lot of that does stem from the fact and that he has all her money, and he has all of her identity. If she doesn't make this work, it's kind of over for her, which is an uber bummer. In this desperation, she begs Christophine to make her a love potion, to make him love her again. Now, I know this potion thing sounds kind of odd and rando out of like the actual book, but not unlike Jane Eyre, there is a sort of supernaturalism to the story. There is that element. It's just more of a darker element. Plan backfires super hard because Edward's body like can't take in whatever she gives him. He ends up getting really, really sick, and he thinks that she poisoned him. Now, in Jane Eyre, it's pretty obvious that Rochester has a great deal of animosity for Bertha, and initially Jane thinks this is because she's mad, and she goes, "You act like she can help being mad. She can't help that, so you can't hate her for that." I'm obviously paraphrasing. And he's like, "No, that's not why I hate her." And so thus, I was really intrigued to see what the author of Wide Sargasso Sea would do with this hatred that he has for Bertha and the reasoning behind that, because it's kind of left to the reader. You can kind of use context clues to figure out some reasons why he might really have a lot of animosity for her. But Jean Rhys like took it to the limit with this one. If you thought that your spouse was trying to poison you, you would have some problems with them. And then we come to what I like to call the Mad Woman piece of this. Yes, I've named it after Taylor Swift's song. I'll explain why. Thinking that he's been poisoned, he behaves abominably. I can't be nice about it. He betrays his whole marriage in the worst possible way. And in a way that I think that Antoinette is 100% justified to be upset about. But because she reacts in a very violent and emotional manner, it's not something that Edward Rochester knows to deal with any kind of feminine figure in his life doing that. He comes from a place where women very much push their emotions down and are pretty calm. So thus we end up with the Taylor Swift Mad Woman moment that I talked about. The every time you call me crazy, I get more crazy situation. Ironically, both the song and this book are very much making a commentary on the fact that if people, especially women in this case, if they try to defend themselves or get really angry and they're very emotional about it and they don't do it in a particular way, you are automatically considered insane. I know this has happened to me. In fact, even earlier in Wide Sargasso Sea, Christophine was saying you really need to talk to him and you have to make sure that you don't cry or get upset because he is not going to react well to that. I think in this case, because of what Rochester thinks happened with the poisoning moment and this adjacent to it, he genuinely thinks he's doing the right thing by everything that follows after. But if you can imagine that you were just really upset about something and you expressed that, and then your husband locked you in an attic in a foreign country to you and then left you with only one caretaker, I think you genuinely would eventually go insane. Who wouldn't struggle keeping any kind of emotional or mental health together going through that situation? I guess it's kind of left up to the reader on whether you think that Edward's actions were things that he did out of sort of a social, psychological, subconscious thing that he just does without really being aware of it, or if it's something that he does intentionally, like he's intentionally gaslighting her. I think I weigh somewhere in the middle. I don't think he was a character in Wide Sargasso Sea that could stop and look at a situation or knew how to deal with things appropriately. And I think a lot of that is why he made the decisions that he made. Not to excuse his decisions, because, y'all, I as a reader was frustrated with him. His pride really got me. But let's face it, the whole point of Jane Eyre is that he had to be seriously humbled before he could truly become like the right man for Jane. We reach part 3, which is very much setting up sort of the events that are going to happen to Jane Eyre, and then a couple of key events from Jane Eyre. Oddly, not a lot to do with Jane herself. I think that is because Antoinette is not really sure of time or what is going on or even the space she's in. Because of aforementioned, I think she genuinely starts to have her own mental issues from the previous events. So there's not a lot of that kind of interaction directly with Jane that is mentioned in there. The one key event that they do mention is her interaction with Richard Mason in Jane Eyre. So that bit where she attacks him, and it's another commentary on that sort of emotional outburst element, because her attack is sort of stimulated by Richard saying, there's no way that I can legally help you out of this situation. So you're basically like stuck here. And yet again, maybe stabbing and biting him wasn't the best way to react, but I think at that point she literally like blacks out, because I think that's obviously gonna upset you. And the other key point is sort of what stimulates her to burn down Thornfield, which I think is very much stemming from a sense of vengeance. Everything that he sort of lived for, right? His name, his prestige, the things that he took pride in, because man is a prideful bloke. All those things, she's going to burn them to the ground. I quite enjoyed this book. I think if you are a person that really loves deep dives into social situations and psychological situations and all the really dark elements of human emotion and human life, you will for sure get in the mood for this. Now, you do have to get in the mood for this because it is a darker book and it does cover quite a few triggering topics. So be prepared to get into your emo dark academia mood, because this is that. I ended up giving this a 4.75 stars. The only reason I didn't give this a 5-star rating is that sometimes I do feel like the author does assume that you know the historical and cultural context of things with events, or she writes something in a super poetical or introspective way where I had to reread passages a few times just to figure out what was happening. But that being said, I didn't find anything in it where I couldn't like read a summary on SparkNotes or something to look up that really did help me understand what was going on. So it didn't impede my reading in any way, and these sections that I'm talking about were few. There weren't like a ton throughout the entire book. Other than that, the writing is pretty easy to get into and read, and the story is very immersive. I just will review the movie because I watched the 2006 adaptation of Wide Sargasso Sea. So this is a pretty solid adaptation. I don't know what the other movie that was made of it. I think that was made sometime in the 90s. I don't know what that one's like, but this one I think did a really solid job. It was very true to the novel, if you already like the novel, and I think the structure of where they put the scenes made a lot of sense to me. It's very good at capturing and encapsulating the kind of odd mood of the piece, which I think was really important. I think it does good at interpreting the book in a visual format, which I think would be something that was a little difficult to do because the book is really introspective. Now, they do sort of skim over or summarize a lot of Antoinette's childhood, which I thought was an intriguing choice, but I totally understood why they did it for the sake of it not being a really long film. But to make up for that, they did add something that I really appreciated, which was actually getting to see Rochester and Antoinette meet, which you don't really get to see in the book, and I kind of wish was in the book a little bit more. So that was a nice addition to me if they were going to add something to the piece. And overall, I appreciated that this gave me a new perspective on the story. I think because the book is very much in the heads of the two main characters, sometimes it's hard to extricate yourself from certain elements or certain thoughts the characters are having and see things in a wider scope. And because you are seeing like every element and all the people's reactions to certain things in the film, I'm getting to like actually see different actors' facial expressions to different things. I think it's kind of nice for the person that previously read the book, or at least it was for me, to see it more objectively of what's going on around maybe the central character. The movie is recommended for 18 years old and plus, and I would concur with that. So don't watch it until you're, old enough to watch it. But other than that, it's a pretty solid piece. I think I give it a solid 4 out of 5-star rating. I probably wouldn't watch it like multiple times because honestly, the subject matter isn't the happiest and isn't gonna like fulfill my soul, but it's definitely not a bad movie. So after my long-winded talk about the end of this book and my final thoughts, which I hope you did enjoy one or the other, I am now done with my Wide Sargasso Sea video. Episode 3 is complete. And now it is time for me to tell you what I will be reading for the month of May. I have chosen to read the graphic novel Modern Retelling, which is just called Jane. So I'm gonna check that out. If you want to read it along with me, I do believe that you can obviously get it in physical copy anywhere you can get graphic novels or anywhere you can find it. But I think it is digitally on Comixology, or it was the last time I looked, so I'm probably going to read it that way. And if you want to read Jane with me, please do. Join in on the fun. Other than that, thank you for watching, my fabulous peeps. I hope you guys enjoyed my little vlog analyzation video, and I will see you all soon with a new video. Bye!